I knew my next topic pretty much right when I finished my Moss Mine video. I wanted to do fantasy cattle, and I wanted my first example to be giant snails. But there was a problem. I googled the definition of cattle. Do you know that cattle is only for bovine animals? So I can't say fantasy cattle. I have to say fantasy livestock instead, and it's just not as fun to say. But anyways, snails. Giant fantasy snails. Now, snails might not be on everyone's cute list, so I'm going to try and sway you a little bit. Snails come in a variety of shell and foot colors, as well as sizes and shapes. They can be small, they can be very large, they can be pets, pests, and a source of food for animals and people alike. They can be beautiful and they can be ugly, but all in all, they're fascinating creatures that should be appreciated, even if it's from a distance. The amount of research and brainstorming I've done for snails in the past month is pages and pages worth, but I had fun. And I have spouted snail info to anyone with an ear in my vicinity on multiple occasions. Snails are fascinating enough in reality that the idea that I get to make them even more interesting through fantasy world building has me very excited. Why snails though? Out of everything out there to start with, why the little garden pests? Well, I have an aquarium, and in it an aquatic snail named Clove. I adore him. Look at him. He is just so much fun to observe. And that love has channeled itself into a new fascination with snails as a whole. With that fascination, I'll be building a huge piece of my world around them. So why would people keep snails as livestock? What would they be good for? First off, the snails of Allowain can grow far larger than the snails in our world. There are still some species of snail that are tiny, but the snails we'll be focusing on today are known as the Maya, the giant snails. There are many different kinds of giant snails, and they're not all related, as Maya is a descriptor, not a species. I'm still working on finalizing the designs of the different varieties of Maya snails, but for now, there are the common, cliff, glass, tilling, guard, and painted snails. They won't see much discussion in this video, though. To begin with, the snail shell. I went down such a rabbit hole with the research on shells and their uses. I landed pretty early on what I wanted to do with them, and I'll try to describe it as easily as I can. Snail shells are made of 98% calcium carbonate. Calcium carbonate is useful for a lot of things, but most notably here is that it is a huge component of making cement. In order to be used in a mix for cement, though, calcium carbonate must be heated to very high temperatures, which creates calcium oxide, also known as quicklime. Once that's mixed with a little water, it's calcium hydroxide, also known as slaked lime. I'm calling calcium carbonate shell dust and calcium oxide fired shell dust. Calcium hydroxide is called anoeka, which I know doesn't really fit the previous theme, but it is what it is. I got the initial idea from ancient Roman cement, which was just slaked lime mixed with water and volcanic ash. At first I thought I could just substitute ash for this formula, but eventually learned otherwise. Volcanic ash is not like wood ash, and it is composed primarily of little shards of volcanic glass, which is silica, alumina, and iron oxide. So to make my snail cement work, I needed these other components. So I made a type of snail whose shell would be composed of these elements, the glass maya, a giant snail that has a shell composed primarily out of glass, but also the other two needed components. The shell dust of this snail was called notin. When you mix notin with anoeka and water, you create cement, which I'm calling shellstone. But the keeping of glass snails was restricted to beaches, as they'd need the sand in their environment in order to make their shells big and strong and healthy. And I wanted the production of shellstone to be easier and widespread. So I pivoted from Roman cement as the inspiration to something called tabby concrete. I think the original idea of incorporating glass maya would still be a type of shellstone, but it would only be prevalent on the coasts. Two different recipes, both called shellstone. For the main recipe of shellstone, tabby concrete is made from lime, water, sand, oyster shells, and ash. So yes, it still needs sand, but way less than a glass snail would need. And rivers can have sand, not just beaches. In that frame of thought, glass snails could be herded inland as well, but in less quantity. They could also possibly be reared in the desert, but they'd need shelter like caves in order to not dry out during the hot years. And tabby concrete still needs ash, but this time it's not volcanic ash. This ash is actually a byproduct of burning the shells. It's a fine white powder that is called oyster shell ash. I'm just gonna call it shell ash. In case it wasn't obvious, oyster shells are made of the same material as snail shells. So, shell ash mixed with anoeka, sand, and water will create my shellstone. They can also add larger bits of the shell into the mix to add more bulk and strength to the stone. Now, I have the makings for my shellstone, but I want it to be colorful. Snail shells come in a wide variety of colors, especially in a fantasy setting. When you have giant snails, their shells are a substantial source of pigments. I can add up to 5% of regular shell dust to the mix for shellstone, and that shell dust could be brightly pigmented, which would make the end product pastel. Fired shell dust could also potentially be pigmented, but I'm not sure how well the color would last through the firing process, which is about 1600 degrees Fahrenheit. Enough on the shell for now, let's talk about eating the snails. People have been eating snails since ancient times here on Earth. A good tagline for them was nutritious, tasty, and easy to catch. Not only did the Romans eat snails, they also considered them an elite food, and even engaged in snail farming. While doing my research, I was surprised at how many places in the world still eat snails in the modern age, and enjoy doing so. From Europe to Asia to Africa. They even eat snail eggs known as snail caviar. As a delicacy in the ancient world, they were known as the pearls of Aphrodite. The flavor of snail pearls is described as being similar to asparagus, mushroom, carrots, or radish tops. A light, earthy flavor with woody notes. Snails lay eggs multiple times a year and can lay hundreds of eggs at a time. Snails bury their eggs in soil, so laying areas provided by Alawain farmers may resemble three-sided box stalls filled with dirt for ease of retrieval, while still having the options to leave them there to hatch. Large snail eggs would be a great source of protein to add to soups reminiscent of egg drop soup, and could also be boiled till solid and eaten like mashed potatoes. One large egg would probably be enough for a family. Smaller snail eggs could be added whole to soups, resulting in a dish I want to call pearl soup. They could also dry out the eggs as a method of preservation and use that as a snack or addition to other recipes. On Alawain, they can store food in conditions similar to Earth's ice boxes. Now on to the meat. The biggest problem people have when eating snails is how tough the foot of the snail's body is. It's described as chewy and rubbery, similar to a firm mushroom or a clam. The flavor of snails is described as mild and earthy. Apparently snails are pretty good at taking on the taste of whatever it's cooked with. Cooking methods on Alawain include slicing meat as thinly as possible or stewing for long periods of time, which helps soften the meat and absorb other flavors. The most common cooking ingredient with snail meat is a fruit called nata. It has a natural enzyme in it that helps to tenderize the meat. It's not the only one, but it's the first to be named. With the nata, you could enjoy your snail meat in thicker slabs, though you'd have to poke lots of holes in it first so the enzyme could reach more of the meat. The snail meat could also be sliced thinly and dried as a preservation method. When ready to eat, you soak the meat in water the day before wanting to use it. Less time is needed for soaking if the meat will be going into a stew. When you have giant snails, you also have a lot of meat. The largest snail recorded on Earth was 12 inches long and weighed 2 pounds. At first you might think a 2-foot-long snail would then weigh 4 pounds. But as things grow larger, they scale volumetrically. Using the 12-inch and 2 pounds as a baseline, and using a rough calculation, I found that a snail twice as big would weigh around 16 pounds. It may not seem like too much of a difference, but as you go up, it gets wild. A 3-foot snail would weigh 160 pounds. A 4-foot snail would weigh 500 pounds. My choice for giant snail size is 6 feet. This snail would weigh a staggering 1,500 pounds. A third of that at least is their shell, and that leaves 1,000 pounds. Once you remove the organs and inedible parts, that leaves you about half of that, which is comparable to an average cow in terms of yield. I'm not sure how much of the organs of a snail weigh, or how much is still considered edible, or if maybe they just feed it all to another type of livestock. One of the things that makes snails more favorable than cows, in addition to their other produces, is they can eat such a variety of things, and they have the ability to hibernate, which is especially useful for a place like Alawain, as Alawain has a very interesting seasonal cycle, including what might be considered a 3-year winter that they call rest. But you may be thinking, a 1,500-pound snail sounds ridiculous. They'd never be able to physically exist at that size, it's just too big. But I have a magic in Alawain that works perfectly for this, a sort of anti-gravity that I made 7 years ago in order to have floating islands. It's called a psyllium, and it can exist in the molecules of living and inorganic things. Once activated, it works opposite of gravity. When done to the exact level of their weight, it makes them weightless. If done more than that, it makes them float upwards. If done less, it just makes them lighter overall. What I love about a psyllium is that it can be activated and deactivated, meaning the weight of an object can be precisely controlled. It makes transporting trade goods easier when it is utilized, and allows my creatures to be larger than reality would let them be. It also allows creatures to levitate, fly, or stand on soft terrain without sinking into it. Anyways, back to snails. There are uses for their slime as well. Slime is primarily water and glycoproteins. Did you know that a lot of beauty products in our world contain snail slime? It's called mucin in the ingredients list. It's supposed to be good for skin and, moisturizing, I guess. So surely magical snail slime would be even more useful for skincare applications. I've seen reference to it being an ingredient used in wound healing, as it's anti-inflammatory and antibacterial. It's even got collagen in it. It will make for a good base for alchemical potions with all those properties. I also thought that it would be cool if it could be used agriculturally. But I'm not sure where I can fit that in yet. As a fertilizer? A pest deterrent? Maybe a water retainment material? What does snail farming entail? Snails will eat a variety of things, from leaves to fruit to mushrooms. In small herds, I think farm snail diets would be things like table scraps from the home, and things easily foraged and added to pens, and even free-ranged throughout the day. Larger farms would have specific fields for their snails to graze in. In a world with giant snails, why not have counterparts of giant crops as well? On Earth, there are many species of fast-growing plants, such as kudzu, that we can draw inspiration from. I have been playing with the idea of combining a plant like stinging nettle with the voracity of the kudzu. I needed something that could grow well during rest, when the sunlight is much weaker than the spring and summer equivalent, prosper. During prosper, this kudzu-like vine grows well in shaded areas, and during rest, it can grow out in the open fields. So far, I've made 2 species of this plant. Aves is farmed for the fiber in its stems that can be turned into thread, while its leaves contain caffeine and are harvested for consumption. Its needles inject caffeine upon contact, so workers must be warded or fully covered before harvesting or tending to the plants. Ethawin does not contain caffeine or dangerous needles, but it grows to much larger sizes and climbs up along any surface. The fibers in its stems are far larger too. It is utilized as a source of food for snails and people alike. Since it grows in different places depending on the season, other crops can be grown on rotation. Ethawin will be a primary food of snails alongside mushrooms. Both these 2 plants create roots all along their stems, and they transplant easily. I know that's a lot of information, and as it's presented it may seem like all the inhabitants of Allowain raise and eat snails and live in shellstone houses. This is definitely not the case. The planet is large, and though snails are common in the grand scheme, it certainly isn't the only livestock to be found. But there is still more about snails I can talk about, including the different varieties that exist on Allowain, from the common to the cliff to the glass to the guard snails. There is a lot more work to be done on finalizing the designs of these various snails and the plants associated with them. I've been writing a lot more than drawing lately, so I need to dive back into art after this video is finished. For closing thoughts, let's go with some real-life snail facts. Did you know that snails don't have ears? Snails can carry up to 10 times their weight even on vertical surfaces. Snails actually have teeth, lots of very tiny teeth, but they use it for scraping, not chewing. Most snail types are hermaphrodites, meaning any 2 snails of the same species can reproduce together, both bearing offspring. Some snails lay over 400 eggs a year. I guess that's all for now. Next video will either be the different giant snail types of Allowain, or about some of the plants of the world like the Nata. Don't forget that your hobby is for your own enjoyment. It does not need to be perfected or even finished to be loved.